Thanks for pointing this out. So yeah, this is the second talk in our two-talk series on fine-grained counting complexity. Last time Holger told you about exponential time counting. And well, today I'm going to talk about parameterized aspects of counting problems. And yeah, let's see what that means. So to begin with, last time Holger started by introducing classical counting problems to you. So in classical counting, we have a generic counting problem, sharp B, where you're given some object X, and you're interested as output in the number of some structures appearing in X or being related to X. So one first example could be count3 set, where you're given a 3CNF formula phi, and you're interested in the number of satisfying assignment to this formula. Another problem would be counting subgraphs. So here you're given as input a pattern graph H and a host graph G, and the quantity you're interested in is the number of H copies in G. So we will discuss this in more detail later. And one very specific instance of the subgraph counting problem would be that of counting perfect matchings, or equivalently in bipartite graphs, the permanent. Here you're given as input a graph, and you just want to output the number of perfect matchings in G. So in classical counting complexity, the outcomes you can typically expect are that your problem is polynomial time solvable, or it's sharply hard under Turing reductions. Just as a recap, sharply hardness under Turing reductions in the case of counting problems means that we have a polytime algorithm that solves count3 set when given an oracle for the counting problem sharp B. And of course, under this notion, we have just trivially shown that counting 3 set is sharply hard. Also, counting subgraphs is sharply hard, because this subsumes as a special case the problem of counting cliques. And in fact, there is a reduction from 3 set to deciding whether a graph contains a clique of a given size. And this reduction preserves the number of solutions, so we end up with hardness for this problem as well. But more interestingly, there is also a hardness result for counting perfect matchings by Valiant's famous result for the permanent. So this is of course interesting because here you really need these Turing reductions, and in particular you cannot use reductions that preserve the number of solutions, because yeah, if you had that, then you had a polytime algorithm for count3 set. So it turns out that here we have 3 sharply hard problems, and from that sample I want to conclude that most problems are sharply hard. I think Holger did something similar last time. So there are ways of relaxing this hard notion to obtain some kind of tractability. And Holger presented to you approximation and sub-exponential counting. In this talk, I'll focus on parameterized counting as some way of relaxing hard problems. So in parameterized counting, the objects in study are again counting problems where you have an input and you ask for the number of some structures appearing in that input. But you additionally have this parameter kappa, which maps instances to natural numbers, and it in some way measures the hardness of your instance. And then examples for such parameterized counting problems could be you're given a graph and the number k, and you're interested in the number of k vertex covers in G. So this is just the counting version of vertex covers. You can be given a graph G, and you're parameterized by the maximum degree of that graph, and you want to output the number of perfect matchings. So this would be a parameterization of counting perfect matchings. And then we have 2 subgraph counting problems. In this left one, you want to count the number of k cliques in a graph. In the right one, you want to count k cycles in a graph. And in both cases, the parameter that we impose on this problem is k. So yeah, we can see that by simple brute force, all of these problems except the middle one can be solved in time n to the k plus some constant. So it kind of makes sense to study these from a parameterized point of view. But the middle one doesn't have this property because in fact it's already sharply hard for maximum degree 3. So there is a sharply hardness result for counting perfect matchings in graphs of maximum degree 3. So we are not going to include problems like this one, which are already hard for a fixed parameter in our studies. And for the other problems, so the yellow ones, of course, the next step is to ask whether they're FPT. So just as a reminder, the problem is FPT, and this applies also to counting problems. If we can solve it in time f of parameter times some polynomial in the input size for some computable function f. And Yeah, it can actually be observed, and this was done by Flum and Grohe, that this classical branching algorithm for deciding whether a graph has a k-vertex cover can be adapted to one that also counts the k-vertex covers in a graph. So this problem would be FPT. But other problems like counting k-cliques in a graph or counting k-cycles in a graph are not FPT, or at least not known to be FPT. And in the case of counting k-cycles, in the case of counting k-cliques, this is probably not too surprising because we already know that deciding whether a graph contains a k-clique is W1 hard, so we don't expect to get an FPT algorithm for the more general problem of counting these cliques. But for the case of counting k-cycles, the situation is different. So there we have an FPT algorithm for decision, and we still don't have an FPT algorithm for counting. So this is somehow an analogon of, let's say, counting perfect matchings in the classical sense. Here we have a problem where the decision version seems to be, where the decision version is actually FPT, but the counting version seems to be harder. But we cannot answer what's going on with classical parameterized complexity here. So what we need is this notion of parameterized counting complexity, which was introduced by Flum and Grohe. So in parameterized counting complexity, we're looking at problems sharp B, like this one. And they can be FPT, or they can be sharp W1 hard, or we don't know, but let's just rule out this case for now. So a problem is sharp W1 hard in this setting if there is a reduction from counting k-cliques to that problem. And this has to be a parameterized reduction. So let me just sketch what that means. That's an FPT algorithm that allows you to count k-cliques if you're given a Sharpie oracle with the additional property that for every query that is asked by this algorithm, the parameter on y is bounded by some computable function on k. Okay, so this is the framework of parameterized counting complexity. And if we apply this to the problems that I mentioned before, then we have just shown that counting k-cliques is sharp W1 hard by definition. But more interestingly, it was shown by Flum and Grohe that, yeah, the problem of counting k-cycles is actually also sharp W1 hard. So this gives us a justification for believing that counting k-cycles should not have an FPT algorithm. Okay, so this would be the general framework that we're interested in, and we will be looking at problems and study whether they're FPT or sharp W1 hard in the remainder of this talk. And in particular, we will look at the following two problems. So in this talk, I'll focus on two problems. In the first one, we just have this subgraph isomorphism counting problem. So you're given as input a pattern graph H and a host graph G. The parameter would be the size of the pattern graph, so its number of vertices, and the output is the number of H copies in G. And in this right problem, we will be studying, well, a special case of the subgraph isomorphism problem, where we don't parameterize by the size of the subgraph that we want to count, but rather by structural parameters on G. So in the left problem, we have a parameter on H. In the right problem, we have one on G. And we want to count the number of perfect matchings appearing in G. So again, in this left problem, a small parameter means that we have a small solution size. In the right problem, a small parameter means that the graph is somehow simple. And the nice thing is that these two problems are related. So you can reduce from one to another, and actually you even get fine-grained results from one direction to the other. Okay, and yeah, let me start the first part of this talk where I'll be studying this counting subgraphs problem. So just as a reminder and to have that on a slide, the problem we're considering is we're given a pattern graph H, which has k vertices. We are given a host graph G on the right-hand side, which has n vertices. And our task is to count those subgraphs of G which are isomorphic to H. And subgraph in that setting means that it does not have to be, it's not necessarily induced. So there is a trivial brute force algorithm that allows you to solve this problem in time f of k times n to the k plus some constant. You can just by brute force guess k vertices in the host graph. And then this induce some subgraph, and in this induced subgraph, you will just count the H copies appearing in that subgraph in time f of k. But there are graph classes on which you can get non-trivial improvements. So one example would be the class of cliques. So you can count, so you can decide whether a graph contains a k-clique in time n to the omega k third, and actually this algorithm also extends to counting. Here omega is the exponent of matrix multiplication. And this essentially exploits that you can count triangles in time n to the omega by computing the trace of some matrix product. And then you essentially reduce counting cliques of size k third. You reduce counting cliques of size k to counting cliques of size k third. And compose this with some triangle construction, which gives you this running time. I guess you've all seen that actually. So yeah, another problem where you can get non-trivial improvements is that of counting k cycles. So it was shown by Björklund and others that you can count k cycles in time n to the 0.46 times k. And this is somewhat interesting because, first of all, it improves upon this trivial n to the k thing, but it actually improves upon something that was known the meet in the middle barrier. So for some time it was believed that kind of the optimal running time for problems like counting k cycles might be n to the k halves. And as you can see, this is lower. So this is quite a non-trivial thing to say. And so all of these algorithms so far actually have running times which are of the form n to the k. Are there also problems where you can get FPT time or maybe even poly time? So yes, there are examples for that as well, but they usually look pretty simple. So one example for a pattern graph that you can actually count in polynomial time would be the k star. So in a k star you just have one center vertex, which is violet, and there are k rays around that. And you can count that in linear time because the number of k stars in a graph is just this expression here. So you sum over all vertices appearing in your graph, this binomial coefficient, which is the degree of the vertex over k. Because once you guessed a vertex that your center can map into, you just have this binomial coefficient many choices for mapping the rays into the neighborhood of that vertex. Okay. And so we've seen that there are graph classes in which you can get non-trivial improvement, sometimes even ranging into the realm of polynomial time feasibility. So it is very natural to ask now, what happens for general classes? So let's say we fix some graph class C, and henceforth we will restrict our pattern to be drawn from that pattern class C. So for which classes can we get FPT time rather than some n to the k time? And this will be a problem that we'll be focusing on in the remainder of this part. So let me just rephrase this. So let's say we're given a graph class C, which is recursively enumerable. Then we define a problem count sub restricted to C. So you're given as input a pattern graph from C and a general graph G. You parameterize by the solution size, so by the size, by the number of vertices in H, and you're interested in the number of H copies appearing in G. So this is a class of problems, one problem for each graph class. And then what you could show is that there's a dichotomy for this problem, for this set of problems along the maximum matching size in the class C. So there's a positive case. So if your graph class C contains only constantly large matchings, so the maximum matching number in this graph class C is bounded by some constant, then you actually get a poly time algorithm. So not even FPT, but just even poly time. And examples for graph classes that have maximum matchings bounded by a constant would be the stars, as we've seen before, or more generally, all graphs that have some vertex cover of bounded size. And on the other side of the dichotomy, the hard cases are given by those graph classes which are unbounded. So whenever you have a graph class C which has unbounded matchings, and the matchings don't have to appear as induced subgraphs, it's just okay that you have subgraphs which are matchings, then you can show sharp W1 hardness of this problem. So this includes the paths, the cycles, which have large matchings, of course. And it also includes the class of matchings, because matchings typically tend to have unbounded matchings. What is somewhat interesting is that this dichotomy, which I've sketched here, actually classifies exactly when the problem of counting subgraphs from a fixed class is polynomial time solvable, if you're willing to assume that FPT is not equal to sharp W1. So you take an assumption from parameterized complexity, and you end up with a classification for polynomial time solvability. So even if you're not interested in FPT at all, then this could be a reason for studying it, because you actually get results in classical complexity from it. And in fact, you can show that in a way, an assumption stronger than P not equal to sharp P, FP not equal to sharp P, is necessary to prove such a dichotomy. Okay, and yeah, so counting subgraphs is hard once these have unbounded matchings. What I want to show in the following is a hardness proof for one specific graph class, so the minimal graph class for which we can get sharp W1 hardness, which would, according to this dichotomy, just be the class of matchings. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll focus on counting K matchings, and I want to show that this problem is sharp W1 hard. Here you can see a problem, here you can see a person who was trying to count 3 matchings in a graph, and she collapsed over the task. So this picture should somehow visually convey to you that counting K matchings is sharp W1 hard.
Where did you get this from?
I took it myself. I mean, it's hard to get this as a stock photo. Yeah, and so I would also like to give a less pictorial argument why counting K matchings is sharp W1 hard, a more formal one. So I want to show that there is an FPT reduction from counting K cliques to counting K matchings. So it's an FPT algorithm that allows you to count K cliques if you're given an oracle for counting matchings of some size function of K. And yeah, this problem, or this like proofs for this problem have some kind of infamous history. There was a first attempt where the reduction was over some problem called counting cycle covers, and it ended up in a weighted version of this problem, so we couldn't show full hardness. Then later we could reduce from this counting cycle covers to actually unweighted matchings. But last year Daniel and I have managed to get a significantly easier and somehow less opaque proof for this hardness result. So in this new route, which is this bottom route shown here, we first reduce counting cliques to counting colorful subgraphs of maximum degree 3. And then from this problem, we go to a colored version of this of the counting matching problems. And in the end, we get rid of colors by some simple inclusion-exclusion argument. So the color of an arrow in this picture should just indicate the complexity of the proof involved for proving that reduction. So last year we had a proof that used 2 green arrows and 1 yellow arrow. And a few weeks, no, actually not a few weeks ago, but a few months ago by now, we found actually a new proof for this yellow arrow. So by now there is a route, there is a path from cliques to matchings which uses only green arrows. And this is what I want to sketch now. So this is the path we consider. We ignore what was done before. We first reduce counting cliques to counting colorful subgraphs of maximum degree 3. So let me define this problem. In the colored subgraphs problem, you are given 2 graphs H and G. So H is again a pattern, and G is some host graph. And in addition, you also have colorings on these graphs. So these are just assignments of colors from 1 up to K to the vertices of H and G. And what you're interested in is the number of color-preserving H copies in G, which will be denoted by this sharp sub of H and G. So a color-preserving H copy is just it's a subgraph of G, which is isomorphic to H respecting colors. So the isomorphism is supposed to map vertices of a given color to vertices of the same color. And in particular, we will focus on this problem in the setting that H has a bijective coloring. So in that case, we speak of a colorful subgraph. And the maximum degree of H is also supposed to be bounded by 3. So even in that specific, in this special case, we can show that the problem is sharp W1 hard by a very simple reduction from cliques to multicolored cliques and then ending up in this problem. And in fact, by this can you be tree width result by Daniel, we can also show that this problem has an n to the omega k over log k time lower bound under counting ETH. So we have this source problem of counting colorful subgraphs, and we now want to reduce this to counting colored matchings. So to do this, we use a technique that we call vertex explosions. And so this name actually kind of makes sense. So in a vertex explosion, let's say we have the setting. We have the setting that we want to count copies of some colorful graph H in a colored graph G. So we're interested in this quantity of these copies. And what we do now is we take this graph H and we explode this yellow vertex. So an explosion just means that so this vertex V, which is this yellow vertex here, will be deleted, and the two edges which were incident with that vertex will just get a vertex of the yellow color. This gives you this graph here, where you reduce this 1 degree 2 vertex to two vertices which each have degree 1. And the great thing about explosions is that if you can count explosions, so if you can count this exploded graph H prime in, like, say, two graphs that we construct from G, then you can, from that, recover the number of subgraphs which are isomorphic to H in the original graph G. So you end up reducing the instance H to G. So this instance of counting H in G can be reduced to two instances of counting H prime in some graph G1 and in another graph G prime. So once you know these two numbers, you can compute from this by some very simple linear algebra this original number of subgraphs. Okay, let me just show how to do this. So let's say we have this exploded graph. Then the new instances that we construct are these graphs GI. So the graph GI is just defined by taking for each yellow vertex in the original graph a copy of that vertex, which is just a vertex on the same neighborhood, which will not be adjacent to the original vertex. So each original vertex in G will be replaced by a block, an independent set of I vertices, which all have the same neighborhood as the previous vertex. And then we can see that the number of, or actually the H copies in the graph GI, they can be partitioned into two types. So in the first type, these two yellow vertices, which arise from the explosion, are contained in the same block. And in the second case, they are contained in different blocks. So we can then see that actually this first case, by contracting these two vertices to 1, we end up with a copy of H in G. Whereas in the second case, we get a copy of H prime in G. And okay, so this is not entirely true, or actually it is true, but to get from these graphs to this number of subgraphs, we have to multiply by some constants. Because a given subgraph H in G can be extended in different ways to some subgraph copy of H prime in GI. And this will give some coefficients. And yeah, we can actually check that the number of H prime subgraphs in G1, this is just by definition the number of H prime subgraphs in G, because G1 is obtained from G by adding nothing. So this equation is just trivial. In the second case, we want to count the copies of H prime in some graph G2, in this graph G2. And then we can actually see that, so the number of H prime copies in G2 corresponds to twice the number of H copies in G, because an H copy of G is one that hits, where the two vertices hit the same block, and there are two ways of doing this. So you can either take this assignment or the one where these two are flipped. And a subgraph copy of H prime in G can be extended in 4 different ways to a copy of H prime in G2. Because here, in this subgraph copy, you will have two blocks which are hit. And in each of these blocks, you have 2 independent choices. So you end up with 4. So in other words, you just got a linear system that gives you, so these are the known values, which are copies of H prime in some other graph, where H prime is this graph that you get by exploding H. And here you have some quantities, of which this one is the one you're interested in. So this is the number of H copies in G, where H was this non-exploded graph. So if you can count explosions, then you can solve this linear system of equations, which obviously has full rank. So you end up recovering this value that you were interested in the first place. And actually, the same approach also allows you to explode a vertex of degree 3. So there you just end up, okay, here we exploded this green vertex and end up with 3 vertices of degree 1. And we have to construct 3 instances, G1, G2, and G3. And yeah, altogether we've seen that we can now explode vertices of degree 2, we can explode vertices of degree 3, and the idea is now to construct a chain of explosions where we successively explode the vertices of our colorful graph until we end up with a matching. And each step is just solving some linear equation system which has 2 or 3 equations and has full rank. So this is very simple. Okay, and let me just state this a bit more explicitly. So this chain of explosions looks as follows. We start with this instance of counting a colorful subgraph H and G. And this colorful subgraph has k vertices and L edges, and its maximum degree is bounded by 3. So then we let's say we explode this yellow vertex, and we end up with a vertex that has with a graph that has 1 less vertex of degree not equal to 1, and 2 instances for the subgraph counting problem. So these are the 2 instances G1 and G2 that we constructed before. So if we can solve each of these 2 instances, then we end up with a solution for this. And then once we exploded this, we can now explode the next vertex. We again removed 1 vertex of degree not equal to 1. And so to solve this instance of counting H prime in Gi, in G1, we get 3 instances of counting H prime prime in G11, G12, and G3. And likewise, you can also get 3 instances for G2. And then you see, of course, that if you repeat this explosion chain for k steps, then you end up with a colored matching on L edges. So this would be this graph after doing k explosions, where each edge that was previously present in your graph is now just a singleton edge, as in it's a k2 on some colors. So you now want to count this hk in some 3 to the k number of graphs. And if you can solve all of these instances of counting colored matchings, then you can solve your original sharp W1 hard problem. So this gives a reduction from counting colorful subgraphs to counting colored k matchings. Okay, let me recap. So there is a reduction from counting cliques to counting colorful subgraphs, which was this problem. Doing this chain of explosions gives you a colored matching. And in the end, well, you can get rid of these colors by some simple inclusion-exclusion argument, which I don't have time to sketch now, but it's easy to check. Essentially, you use here that each edge has a unique pair of colors appearing in it. So you can, in particular, count those matchings in an uncolored graph, which would avoid a certain set of edge colors. And this is a setting where you can apply inclusion-exclusion. And then also quite nicely is that since there is this lower bound for counting colorful subgraphs, we also get lower bounds for counting matchings under sharp ETH. And these lower bounds are unfortunately not really tight, but I'll mention later what could be possibly done to get tighter lower bounds here. Okay, then let me just summarize this first half of the talk. So in this first half, we were considering this subgraph counting problem where you're given a pattern and a host, and you're parameterized by the size of the pattern. And we've seen that this problem is sharp W1 hard if the pattern is a matching. And more generally, I mentioned that there is a hardness proof that shows that the problem is sharp W1 hard whenever H contains a large matching. And then using a lower bound for counting colorful edge subgraphs, counting colorful L edge subgraphs, we get an almost tight lower bound for this problem under sharp ETH as well. Okay. This concludes the first half of my talk. I have to switch the presentations now because apparently PowerPoint uses some exponential time algorithms to render the slides. then it's better to have two instances of size n halves rather than one instance of size n. So this is the second part of this talk, where we will consider counting perfect matchings by structural parameters. And let me just recap from last time what we know about this problem. So it was shown by Valiant that counting perfect matchings is sharply hard, even on bipartite graphs. And I mentioned before that this holds even if the maximum degree of your graph is bounded by 3. So in other words, counting perfect matchings parameterized by the degree is, so if you want to parameterize by the degree, then you don't end up with a structural parameter that is interesting for this problem. And to actually show parameters that make sense, I first have to mention some known polynomial time feasible classes. And the most famous one among these would be the class of planar graphs. So there is a famous algorithm from the 1960s by Fisher, Castellane, and Temperley, which shows that counting perfect matchings in planar graphs can actually be reduced to the determinant. And since we know how to compute the determinant, we get a polynomial time algorithm for counting perfect matchings in planar graphs. And then this is already nice, but it was actually generalized later. So it is also known that for every fixed genus, you can get a polynomial time algorithm. And people didn't state it that way, but of course, if you look at the running time, then this is an FPT algorithm. So if you're given a graph G, which is embedded on a surface of genus K, then you can count perfect matchings in that graph in time 4 to the K times n cubed. And essentially, this works by reducing this problem to 4 to the K linear combinations of determinants. And so we get an FPT algorithm for the genus. And there's another parameter that could be interesting, or actually, we can just generalize this planar algorithm in another way. So that would be to a planar graph which has K additional APCs. So this just means that we have a graph which is planar after deleting this set of blue vertices, which are called apex vertices. And let's assume that we are given these K apex vertices together with our input. Then you can actually get an algorithm that runs in time n to the K plus 3 just by applying brute force and the FKT method. Because for each apex, you just have to guess its partner in the planar base graph. And then once you guessed all the partners, you can delete the APCs and their partners, and you end up with an instance of counting perfect matchings in the planar graph. And so this parameter is nice because it's FPT. This one is probably not so nice because, well, this is an algorithm that solves it, and we don't know any algorithms that do it significantly better. So in the remainder of this talk, I will show, among other things, that this problem is sharp W1 hard, and that this actually has some nice implications reaching further than this specific hardness result. And to state those, let me just survey some graph parameters that are relevant in the study of counting perfect matchings. So I mentioned before already the genus and the apex number. So the apex number of a graph, just to recall that, is the minimum size of a vertex set in your graph, such that deleting this vertex set gives you a planar graph. Okay. Then another parameter that is always nice to study is, of course, the tree width. And all of these parameters are subsumed by a more general parameter, which is called the Hartwiger number. So the Hartwiger number of a graph is just the maximum number k, such that your graph G has a k-clique minor. So if this number is bounded, then you exclude some graph as a minor. And there are nice structural properties of graphs excluding fixed minors, and maybe they could be used for counting perfect matchings as well. And then there's a related number, which is very related to the Hartwiger number, which could be called the single crossing Hartwiger number or the single crossing minor number. So this would just be the minimum size of an excluded single crossing minor. So for instance, planar graphs exclude K33 and K5. So their single crossing minor number would be bounded by 5, because K5 is a graph that can be drawn in the plane with at most one crossing, as shown here. I should mention that the single crossing graph is a graph that you can draw in the plane with at most one crossing. And among these parameters, you can define a hierarchy. So if one parameter is bounded, then this can also bound other parameters. For instance, a trivial instance for such a relation would be, well, if the single crossing minor number is bounded, then of course you exclude some graph, so you also have a bounded Hartwigger number. Also, if you have a graph of bounded genus, then it's known that such graphs exclude some fixed set of minors, so you also have bounded Hartwigger number. You can also show that if the apex number is bounded, you also have bounded Hartwigger number. And in fact, if you have bounded tree width, then you have single crossing number also being bounded, because graphs of bounded tree width exclude a planar graph as a minor. And the planar graph is, of course, one that can be drawn in the plane with at most one crossing. So these would be the parameters that we're looking at in the following. And let me just survey some algorithmic results that are known for these parameters. So for the genus, I've mentioned already before that there is this 4 to the genus times n to the omega algorithm, actually. And so we could recently show that there is no 2 to the little o of genus times poly n algorithm for this problem unless sharp ETH fails. So this exponential dependence on the genus has to be there, but we don't quite know whether 4 is the correct base in the running time. So for the apex number, we have seen this trivial brute force algorithm that solves the problem in time n to the k. And we can show that unless sharp ETH fails, you cannot get it in time n to the little of k over log k. And also this hardness result also gives you sharp W1 hardness. Then considering tree width, there is an algorithm that runs in time 2 to the tree width by working on the 3D composition and doing dynamic programming with some extra trick. So this is a non-trivial algorithm. And we could show that there is no 2 minus epsilon to the tree width algorithm unless the counting version of the strong exponential time hypothesis fails. But what is nice is that you can actually generalize this tractability result for tree width also to single crossing minor number. So it is known that if you exclude a single crossing minor of size k, then you get a running time of f of k times some polynomial. And yeah, this just leaves open this last most general parameter, the Hartwigger number. So in this setting, just the lower bound for the apex number will also give us a lower bound for counting perfect matchings under the Hartwigger number. But what we don't know is whether this algorithm can be, whether this problem can be solved in time n to some function of k. So in fact, we don't even know whether there is some fixed graph class which excludes some fixed minor, and the problem of counting perfect matchings is already sharp p hard on that problem. We don't know whether such a graph class exists. It could be that maybe if like the Hartwigger number is just 100 or whatever, then you can actually encode a SAT instance into that problem. We don't know that. A SAT instance. Okay, so this is a survey of the results that I'm aware of for counting perfect matchings parameterized by structural parameters of the graph. And what I want to show in the remainder of this talk is how to prove such stuff. So in particular, I want to show a lower bound for the apex number under sharp ETH. So I want to show that this trivial algorithm cannot be improved by too much, assuming that sharp ETH holds. And we have a general proof approach for proving these kind of statements. So for proving lower bounds, and also for proving upper bounds, we can use the so-called Holant framework. So I will explain later what that actually is. But the general idea is just that we start with some instance xk to a parameterized problem. We reduce this to the evaluation of some quantity which is called the Holant. And then this Holant problem will be reduced to counting perfect matchings on some graph where the parameter will be bounded by some function of k. And there's a very nice and formal way of doing these reductions. So to explain how this works, I first have to introduce this notion of Holant problems. So a Holant problem is defined as follows. So the input to a Holant problem is a signature graph omega. The signature graph is just some graph. And at each vertex, it has a so-called signature attached to it. So the signature at vertex v is just a function fv, which maps from binary assignments to the edges incident with v to some complex number. So let's have a look at this example down here. We have this graph. There is this green vertex. And this green vertex might have this particular signature. So if the two edges incident with that vertex are both labeled 0, it will output 40. And on other assignments, it will output something different. And generally, you can assign whatever signature you like to a vertex. And then once you have defined a signature graph like this, you can define a quantity which is called the Holant of that signature graph. So the Holant of a signature graph is just a sum over all the edge assignments to your graph. And for each edge assignment, you look at this product here. So you take a product over all the vertices appearing in your signature graph. And each vertex will look at the assignment x restricted to the edges incident with it. It will evaluate the signature on that given sub-assignment. And then you take the product over all these evaluations, and you sum this up for all edge assignments. So this might look a bit weird, but let's have a first example for what you can encode as a Holant problem. So for instance, we can encode counting perfect matchings as a Holant problem in a very simple way, because you can just assign this perfect matching signature to all vertices of your graph. So the perfect matching signature just looks at the edges incident with your vertex, and it outputs 1 if there is a unique 1 among these edges, otherwise it will output 0. And then we can see that if you apply this perfect matching signature to all vertices of your graph, then you end up with an instance for counting perfect matchings in the graph. So to give an example for this, this would be an edge assignment, and the blue edges are those that are labeled 1. Then this bottom vertex here, this vertex v, will look at its incident edges. It will see that there is exactly one edge which has label 1, so the signature will output 1. And in fact, every vertex will do that, because of course every vertex has a unique edge incoming. And likewise, so okay, all these vertices output 1, and if you take the product of all these values, you end up with a 1, so a perfect matching will be counted with a 1. And likewise, if you have some vertex at which this local constraint is not fulfilled, then that vertex will give you a 0, so that assignment will not be counted in the Holant. So non-perfect matchings will get value 0. And this is already nice, because it shows us that Holant problems are more general than counting perfect matchings, and we can, this problem is in general more general than counting perfect matchings, but we can encode counting perfect matchings in a natural way into it. But the fact that it's more general allows us to encode like arbitrary parameterized problems into it, as long as these have some kind of local structure to it, which we can capture by these signatures. All right, so it is often easy to encode a parameterized problem as a Holant problem, but it turns out that there is also a nice way of then reducing Holant problems back to counting perfect matchings. So this special case of counting perfect matchings is actually something that you can often reduce a Holant problem to. And you can also do it in such a way that, or you can often do it in such a way that like the parameter on this instance that you get in the end will be bounded by some function of k. And to do this second step in the reduction, you can use this notion of so-called Matchgates, which have been studied before already. So a Matchgate is just a signature graph gamma on some edge set E, and some of these edges are dangling, so they have only one endpoint instead of 2. And these Matchgates have the property that every vertex has only the perfect matching signature to it. So all signatures appearing in a Matchgate have the perfect matching signature. And then essentially you can intuitively treat a Matchgate like a single vertex which has a given signature attached to it. So you can, like, in a formal way, contract this Matchgate gamma to a single vertex, assign a signature to it which can be computed from gamma, and this signature will look at edge assignments to the dangling edges of that gamma and output some complex number. And then the use case for Matchgates that we will be usually working with is that you have a signature graph omega, and each vertex v in that signature graph has some signature fv. And for each vertex you also have a matchgate gamma v, which has exactly that signature. Then you can insert this matchgate at all vertices to get some other signature graph omega prime. So I'll show in this animation. Yeah, this was an insertion of a matchgate at v. And then you can check by a very simple calculation that this operation preserves the Holant. So the definition of these signatures and the definition of Holants allow you to just show this equality, which is great because now you end up with an instance for a Holant problem where all signatures are the perfect matching signature. So in other words, you end up with a problem of counting perfect matchings, as we've seen on that previous slide. All right, so in other words, we can prove stuff via Holant problems by taking some parameterized problem, encoding this as a Holant problem, and then using Matchgates to reduce this to counting perfect matchings. But I mean, it's great if this approach works, and actually using this approach, we could prove the lower bound for counting perfect matchings under the genus parameter or under tree width. But often, this relatively simple approach doesn't work, and we have to do some more complicated stuff. So actually, what is nice about the Holant framework is that it can give you FPT reductions in a very natural way. So there is a very intuitive way of reducing a Holant problem omega to some f of k instances of other Holant problems by some very elementary linear algebra, such that these Holant problems might have signatures that are better to deal with, or signatures that you can realize by Matchgates in a better way. So sometimes this simple road doesn't work, and then you have to reduce your problem to many instances, but this is okay in the setting of an FPT reduction. So how does this second step work? So in the second step, we're using something which is called combined signatures, or just linear combinations of signatures. Let's say we have a signature graph omega, and this signature graph has some set of special vertices x, which contains vertices v1 up to vk. At each vertex, which is not contained in x, we have the perfect matching signature. And at vertex vi in the set of special vertices, we have some special signature fi. And let's furthermore assume that for each I, there are two matchgate signatures, gi1 and gi2, such that you can express fi as a linear combination of these two matchgate signatures. So here this linear combination is to be understood pointwise. So this holds at every edge assignment. Then what you can show is that, let's define for each k tuple pi over the set 1 and 2. For each set k tuple, let's define a signature graph omega pi by replacing for each I in k the signature fi by the signature gi pi I. So this original graph that we started with had some special vertices which had special signatures, but each special signature can be expressed as a linear combination of two non-special or matchgate signatures. And then we get these graphs here where we replaced all special signatures by some particular choice of these linear combination constituents. And you end up with graphs that have only perfect matching signatures on it, or that have no special signatures left. And this can be used to take a signature graph which has some signatures which are too complex for us to realize. We express these special signatures which are too complex as some linear combination of simpler signatures. And then we end up with these graphs which have only the simple signatures in them. And the great thing is that by some very elementary algebra, you can show that the Holant of your original signature graph omega is just the sum over all these Holants of the derived signature graphs. And in general, you can apply an arbitrary linear combination at this step. You don't have to just take the sum, and you can also take arbitrarily many constituents into your combination. And if you apply this, then you end up with Yeah, so the typical setting for doing this would be that you start with a parameterized problem, you transform this to a Holant problem on some h of k number of special vertices, and yeah, then you use this simple sum equation to get some number of Holant problems which have only non-special vertices, and then you use Matchgates in the end to end up with counting perfect matchings. So in particular, we can use this approach for a reduction from counting so-called sparse grid tilings to counting perfect matchings on O of k APCs. And for this problem, we can show a lower bound, which is almost tight. Then we also get the same lower bound for this problem. So
this works whenever you can express a signature as a linear combination, whenever you can express all your signatures as constant-sized linear combinations of Matchgate signatures?
Matchgate signatures which have some certain properties that you want to enforce. So for instance, in our case, we want to have signatures which have bounded apex number. So you can just use this but yeah, the reduction in the previous slide would just use a Matchgate signature in general. In general, you can apply pretty much any signature as a simpler, so it is completely open to you what you want to define as simpler. Simpler could mean that it is just a Matchgate signature. It could mean that it's the signature of a planar Matchgate. It could mean that it's the signature of a Matchgate with two APCs, whatever. This is just a general way of breaking down complex signatures into less complex signatures. And the way I've presented it on the previous slide was just that, well, simple would just mean it's a Matchgate signature. Okay, let me just define first this problem of counting sparse grid tilings. So in the problem of counting sparse grid tilings, we're given as inputs two numbers n and k, and some special index set s, which is a subset of the pairs you can build with elements from 1 up to k. So you can imagine this problem to be essentially a grid, which is just a k times k grid, and then some of the cells in that grid are special. And for each special cell, you have this property that you have a set Aij, which is a subset of the pairs you can get from 1 up to n. And what you're interested in is the number of pairs Rc. So, okay, what you're interested in is the number of labelings of the rows and the columns of that grid, such that at each special cell, the row labeling and the column labeling taken together as a pair is contained in that set Aij. So, okay, this would be a possible labeling of the columns. This would be a possible labeling of the rows. Then you want that at this special vertex A32, the pair 4, 6 is contained in your set. And this problem can be shown to be sharp W1 complete. And in fact, it has a lower bound of n to the omega k over log k time under sharp ETH, even if the size of the special set is linear in k. Yeah, so then we can reduce this problem, which obviously has a very local structure, to a signature graph omega, which is planar and has linearly many special vertices. So yeah, for each cell we put a vertex, and there will be non-special vertices and special vertices. We put some extra column vertices into our graph and some extra row vertices, and edge bundles. So each edge bundle is a set of n parallel edges that runs vertically. We do the same horizontally. And then we assign the perfect matching signatures to the row vertices, to the column vertices and the row vertices, and certain cell signatures to the other vertices. So there will be a cell signature which is non-special and a special cell signature. And these signatures together will just ensure that the Holant of the signature graph encodes the number of those pairs. And I mean, you just have to believe me that this can be expressed as a Holant problem, but it should be believable because this problem has a very local nature to it. Like at each vertex you can check whether this condition is fulfilled. And then essentially what we're doing is, so we take the cell signature, we realize it by a planar Matchgate, and we take the special cell signature and realize it by a linear combination of a planar Matchgate and a 2-apex Matchgate. So altogether, this gives us a reduction from counting sparse grid tilings, which has this lower bound, to counting Holants in a planar signature graph, which has O of k special vertices. And then using this linear combination of matchgates, we insert planar matchgates and two apex matchgates. So we insert planar matchgates at the non-special vertices, and we insert planar matchgates and possibly also two apex matchgates at the special vertices. So the worst we can get is an instance which has O of k APCs at it. So this would be an example where we use linear combinations, not just to express as a matchgate, but actually to express as a matchgate which has an additional bounded parameter. So the apex number would be bounded.
So what exactly is a planar matchgate? I thought matchgate is just a perfect matching. Signature corresponds to a matching.
So a planar matchgate would just be a matchgate as we've defined before. And additionally, you can draw it in the plane such that all these dangling edges are on the outer face.
So that green blob that you have is a planar.
Essentially, yeah, you can essentially just consider this vertex as it hides some gadget underneath. And this gadget is actually the planar drawing of some other gadget graph. Yeah, and if you insert such two apex matchgates into a planar graph, then you can see that like the apex number will just be 2 times the number of insertions you made. Okay, so then we get this lower bound as well. All right, then let me just conclude my talk. So this talk consisted of 2 parts. In the first part, we were considering the subgraph counting problem where you were given a pattern and a host. You parameterized by the size of the pattern, and you wanted to count the number of H copies in that graph. You've seen that this problem is sharp W1 hard if you're considering matchings. And we also considered counting perfect matchings under structural parameters. I mentioned that this problem is FPT by genus, tree width, and excluded 1 crossing minors. And I've given a sketch of how to show that the problem is sharp W1 hard under the apex number. Let me just mention some open problems. So one big open problem would be if you can count perfect matchings parameterized by the Hartwigger number in time n to the f of k. So what do we know here? So we know that we can handle surfaces of bounded genus in FPT time. We can handle APCs in time n to the k, and we can do significantly better. We can handle clique sums of surfaces that have APCs attached to them. But what we cannot do is handling vortices. So in fact, we already run into a problem, or we're already devastated by the very simple case of having a plane with 1 vortex on it. And if someone could solve that, that would be pretty great. If you can count perfect matchings in a graph that is planar up to 1 vertex. And then another thing would be if you can improve this lower bound, which is known for this problem of deciding whether a graph has a colorful subgraph on L edges. So there you have this lower bound of n to the omega L over L. Can you get an improvement if you're considering counting instead of deciding? And also, can you get a faster algorithm for counting perfect matchings parameterized by APCs? So here actually you have even a further restriction that you may impose on the problem. It's even okay to count just modulo 2 to the k, the number of perfect matchings. And if you had a faster algorithm for counting perfect matchings in k apex graphs modulo 2 to the k, you would also end up with a fast algorithm for this problem. And just because this seems to be one of the weirder connections between this problem and some other problem, I would suggest looking at it. Okay, so this concludes my talk. And for everyone who watched this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to the Simons Institute to get more results on complexity, ETH, and sharp W1. And thank you for your attention.
When you do that dichotomy by Kowalik, based on the size of a maximum matching in the pattern graph H, then if that's bounded, then counting is all over. What's the exponent of the polynomial? Does it depend on that bound? Does the bound show up in the exponent of the polynomial?
So there is an algorithm that allows you to count essentially in time n to the vertex cover, I think.
So that could possibly be FPT to get that down out of the exponent. Is that right?
Right now.
I think so. I think it's like the entire graph is a vertex cover for itself, and there's W1 W sharp hardness on the the number W1 hardness on the second side. So
Yeah.
So you cannot have FPT parameterized by the size of the graph you're looking for. According to this result. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's no problem.
So is counting perfect matchings FPT parameterized by Clickwood?
No, we actually have a sharp W2 hardness result, which I didn't mention, because it's a bit weird, because so all these algorithms that I mentioned before, they also work in weighted cases, and well, click within weighted graphs is usually something that doesn't make too much sense. But if you just parameterize by click with, you end up with a sharp W2 hardness result. And actually a tight lower bound under SETH. So you can solve it in time n to the k plus some constant, but if you could solve it in n to the k minus some other constant, then you would have broken SETH, and this holds for every fixed click with k.
If not, then let's thank the speaker again.
Thanks.